I just wanted some clarification on tithing.
Being unable to forgive somebody who causes an offense
Does
towards
it really matter whether someone is Protestant or Catholic?
The genealogies are different from Matthew to Luke.
I was wondering what the Bible said in terms of what I should do.
This is Pastor's Perspective. We're here every Monday through Friday providing answers on a variety of topics, including the Bible, end times, other religions, and the family. Call right now with your question at 1-888-564-6173. That's 888-564-6173. You can also post your question at facebook.com/Pastor's Perspective. And now here again is your host, Brian Perez.
Hello and welcome to the Pastor's Perspective program. Brian Perez here with a couple of special guests in the studio with me today. We've got apologist Bobby Conway. You can find him on YouTube when you do a search for 1 Minute Apologist. And our guest is Sean McDowell, who... Woo-hoo. Well, you know what Bobby thinks of Sean.
Go, Sean! Go, Sean!
Are you excited to have somebody else bail you out on the tough questions today, Bobby?
That's right. Come on, dude.
See, that's a better introduction than I could have done, because my introduction would have been all formal and blah, blah, blah. Well, he did this. Hey, he's got his PhD from this.
Well,
blah,
take
blah, blah.
a look at Sean. Everything about him says formal, right?
Yes, he's in here with his... This is great. So, you know what, though? It's today, we've got two apologists in the studio on the same day that we found out, like 10 hours ago, that Ravi Zacharias has gone home to be with the Lord after a battle with sarcoma. He was 74 years old. We had been praying for him, and today the Lord called him home. Did you guys ever meet Ravi?
You know, for me personally, I've had the privilege of meeting, most of the apologists, and that is the one that I really wanted to get to know. I mean, I've been down to Ravi Zacharias International Ministries and have, captured videos with some of the great staff that he has there, Abdu Murray, Vince Vitelli, Joe, and others. But I just never was able to cross paths. And so as I was driving up to do this program today, I was thinking about Sean, and I'm thinking, surely you've met Ravi through the years. And
you know what's interesting about this is I've spoken at conferences with Ravi, events with Ravi, but it's always different times in different places for whatever reason. One time I met him, 1996 in Atlanta, was working when the Olympics were there, selling T-shirts. My dad set it up, and he called up Ravi, and we went out for a meal and got to meet him then. So I've followed his ministry, and he's been like a spiritual father to me in many ways, like so many other people, but have not spent as much time in person with him as maybe some people would expect.
But at least you can say you have met the great Ravi Zacharias. And wow, it was, hard to hear the news, because what we found out recently is he has his back surgery, and it goes to reveal that he has this tumor and this cancer. And wow, it kind of just looked like this is going to get healed. This is the way the narrative is going to work.
Yeah.
And then so quickly he's gone. What would you say about Ravi and some of the contribution that he has made in the area of apologetics, Sean?
Oh, my goodness. I think there's a handful of people that I put on just the top shelf in terms of their ability to communicate, their passion for the gospel, their integrity, their creativity, just their faithfulness through an entire generation. I mean, until the end, in an age when there's every reason not to be faithful, whether it's morally or theologically, to cave to some pressure, he stayed faithful.
That's right. Yeah.
And I saw a tweet today, that said, thanks, Ravi, for teaching us how you lived. You gave your final lesson. Oh, I'm getting teary-eyed. He said, you taught us how to die. I just thought, man alive, that's how I want to go out whenever the Lord takes me.
Yeah. There might be people listening who don't know who Ravi Zacharias is, so I believe do we have the video that we're going to show on our YouTube and Facebook? Is that ready to roll? We also have audio. We have both. Okay, so let's do the video. Here it is.
Through pain, through enduring pain, you can easily say, Lord, you've called me to travel. You've called me to do this. Why did you give me a body such as this? I have learned what Annie Johnston Flint said. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. The church can preach all at once, but if it is a church that doesn't reach out and touch and feel and embrace and be charitable, it will miss the opportunity to be the hands of God and the hands of Christ in a very hurting world. Christ offers to you and me eternal life with a quality beginning right now. He shows you your heart. He provides for you a cure for the malady. He calls you into a relationship with God, making all things sacred for you. He takes you through pain and sorrow and bereavement, and he offers you hope. Hope that is not just beyond the grave, but hope that is present even now.
Ravi Zacharias went home to be with the Lord this morning at the age of 74 after a brief battle with sarcoma. And you guys here in the studio with me, Bobby Conway and our guest, Sean McDowell, sometimes people view apologists as, oh, you guys are the ones that are trained to win arguments. You know, you're the one that we want to, when we're debating with a friend about something, we want to have you on speed dial so that we can say, hey, can you talk to my friend here and tell him why he's wrong? But it's not about arguments and things like that. It's not about apologizing even, as sometimes people think. What, do you guys just go around saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry? But in that video that we just watched and that we heard on radio, Ravi's heart, it was all about the Lord and all about leading people to Christ. It wasn't about winning arguments. It was about, you know, this is what you need. This is why you need it. So, yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Ravi knew that truth is what set people free, but he also knew that the best way for people to understand truth was to give them honor and to love them during the process. And that's what he did well. I mean, hundreds of hours listening to his podcast, seeing him speak, and never once saw him demean another human being. He spoke truth boldly, but did it out of love and kindness for people. And that's just rare. And that's what apologetics is supposed to be. The other thing he did is he always knew behind apologetic questions, there was often a deeper question people were asking. Do I belong? Am I loved? Is there going to be healing for my hurt and my pain? And he knew how to use apologetics to get to somebody's heart and ultimately to lead them to the gospel. I could count on my hands how many people I think did that as effectively as Ravi did.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I sit in the studio today, you know, I'm so thankful that you're with us, Sean, because when I think of Ravi Zacharias and his impact, he is somebody who was incredibly sharp. He was humble. He had a lot of fame, but he always knew how to take the message and reach the masses with it. And when I look at you, Sean, you know how I've always appreciated you. And here we have Sean McDowell on as a guest who comes from a famous line with his father being Josh McDowell. You know, people are familiar with, you know, Josh, the writer of More Than a Carpenter, Evidence of Man's Verdict, and many more books. And Sean, from the first time I've met you, I've always been blown away by you as an apologist, because I see you as somebody that has come from some great Christian stock, and at the same token, no one would ever know that just talking to you. You treat people in such a great way. And, you know, there's apologists out there like Sean McDowell and Ravi Zacharias that have really made me realize that there is some truth, that apologists can get this reputation for being arrogant. But most of the apologists I know are such fantastic, good, godly, everyday people. And I'm thankful for the fact that we have great minds like Sean McDowell helping us to defend the faith.
Yeah. We've got one more piece of audio we want to play. This is audio only. It's Dr. Ravi Zacharias. He did radio programs for years. Let My People Think is his weekly program. There's also one called Just Thinking. And he did a 60-second feature called Just a Thought, and we have one of those right now that we can listen to.
In the days of Elisha, there were many lepers in Israel, but none of them was cleansed except a Syrian by the name of Naaman. Friends, some of us within the confines of the churches are going to miss the miraculous working of God because we don't expect Him to work. We have learned to be content with our creeds, with our songs, with our sermons, with our business as usual. We no longer expect God to break through. I remember one of my professors of preaching at my graduate studies saying to me, remember as you preach, every sermon is an event. Expect God to break through. Are you willing to trust God for a miracle in your life tonight? What is your relationship between faith and the will?
Helping the thinker believe and the believer think. For more information, go to rzim.org.
Just another example of his heart, of him wanting people to come to faith and to know why they believe what they believe and not just to be spewing out answers.
Yeah, I can imagine people listening to that audio clip right there and thinking, well, what about Ravi's miracle? I mean, he was the one with cancer. What about his miracle? And I want to say, oh, he got the miracle.
Yeah.
It's called the ultimate miracle.
Yeah.
You know, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord.
You know, you mentioned my father earlier, and when I look at someone like Ravi, I know from being a kid growing up, the temptations that come with that, the expectations that come with that, the way people treat you differently. And that's one reason you see a lot of people fade away and burn out and fall away. So when I see somebody like Ravi, same message from the beginning. When he started at RZAM, I believe in his late 30s, consistently speaking, building relationships, preaching the gospel, moral clarity. I mean, I can't have more respect for somebody than that. And I just thank the Lord for his life and his ministry.
In case you just joined us, this is Pastor's Perspective. Brian Perez here with Bobby Conway and our guest, Sean McDowell. And we're paying tribute the first few minutes to Dr. Ravi Zacharias, who went home to be with the Lord this morning at the age of 74. And so we've got Sean McDowell in the studio. And Bobby, you guys have known each other for how long?
Well, for quite a few years now. You know, the first time I met Sean, I was at a conference, and he was walking around, I think, in some Spider-Man outfit or something.
Outfit, not just a T-shirt.
Full outfit. Sure.
Yeah, I think he had the full mask on. He was pre-preparing for COVID-19 masks and all that.
Exactly.
But the first time I met Sean, you know, to know him is to love him. I mean, seriously, and just connected with him. And then he's been such a blessing in my life, endorsing different books as they've come out and reading stuff for me and just being a friend that when I bump into him, I could ask him questions, pick his head. And I just really have appreciated him. And I love that, we are both in Orange County, and he was able to find some time in his calendar to come up here. And I just thought, it would be great just to let him join us on the program doing what we do. And then also just to talk a little bit about, some of his research and some of the work that Sean has done. Sean has got his PhD from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, a great prestigious seminary. And he did his PhD research on the fate of the apostles. And interestingly enough, as I was driving home from work yesterday, I was talking to my dad, and he says, hey, your mom wants to know this. Whatever happened to, this particular apostle? And I said, well, interestingly enough, Sean McDowell will be on the program tomorrow. And so I thought, hey, Sean, you did your PhD on the fate of the apostles. And like the Christmas story, there can be a lot of myths that wrap up around the Christmas story. In the same way, having taken the time to study the apostles, we've often heard they all died a martyr's death but one. What are some of the myths and what are some of the truths as it relates to the apostles?
Well, the myth is that they all died except for one. That's the one that we hear. And frankly, before I did this research, I've heard people say that, and I said it myself until I thought, you know what, I want to find out what the actual evidence is that these guys lived, that they went on missionary journeys, and they actually died proclaiming their faith. And I think if we look through a historical lens of the 12 apostles, I think we have good reason to believe that Peter and James, son of Zebedee, high historical confidence, actually died as martyrs. I think at best, more plausible than not, would be Thomas and would be Andrew. I think the 8 remaining, we don't know when history ends and when legend begins. We just don't. So the stories of Bartholomew, him being skinned alive, don't really show up till 500 AD. Wow. Doesn't mean it's false, but it just means our historical confidence is low. Now, on top of that, if you add James, a brother of Jesus, who had an appearance of Jesus, the leader of the early church, and you add Paul, of course, then you have 2 more leading apostles who I also believe died as martyrs. So bottom line is, we don't have to show that any of them died as martyrs because this argument doesn't show the resurrection is true. All it shows is that they're not inventing this story. They're not lying to put themselves in harm's way. And you just read the beginning of Acts, and what happens? They're proclaiming the risen Jesus. They're beaten. They're threatened. They're thrown in prison. Stephen's killed. James killed in Acts 12 too. They are intentionally putting themselves in harm's way. That doesn't make sense if this is a message that they've made up. So this is one piece of a larger resurrection argument that tells us this is not a big conspiracy.
What about Peter? We often hear that, you know, tradition says that he hung upside down, not feeling worthy to be crucified, you know, right side up. What are your thoughts as it relates to the historicity of that accuracy?
So the rest of that story goes, he didn't feel worthy, so he asked the Roman executioners to crucify him upside down. Let me ask you a question. Do you think the Roman executioners were in the habit of taking suggestions about how you wanted to be crucified? Right? I mean,
if anything, they might do the opposite.
That's exactly right. Let's give him what he doesn't want.
Yeah.
So I actually, the first reference of him being crucified upside down is in a book called The Acts of Peter, the end of the 2nd century. And if you read the account, it's actually the reason he's upside down is because the world has been turned upside down by sin, and his death, like the death of Jesus, will help turn it right side up. So it's a theological point, not a historical point. And then later church writers pick up on that in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century and talk about it being historical. Now, there is precedent, if you read Martin Hengel's book on crucifixion, of people being crucified upside down. But I think if I'm going to assess that historically, at best you'd say it's possible. But I'll tell you something that's interesting. It says at the end of John, in John 21, where Jesus says to Peter, you will be taken where you do not want to go. And then, you know, in English parentheses, it says, indicating the way he would die. What does it say to Peter? That you will be clothed by another. What do we know about crucifixion? If anything, the person was stripped bare to be humiliated. So I've come to think he probably wasn't even crucified at all. I think he died as a martyr, but probably not crucified, let alone crucified upside down.
See, isn't that interesting?
It is.
You delve into the history and you start learning, wow, what's going on here?
Because there's so many things that we've been taught and we've just accepted because, after all, it's our pastor who's telling the story.
Right.
And I'm not talking to my pastor right now because my pastor is one of these guys, you know, Brian Broderson, who he'll say, like Sean just did, no, not true. That never happened. But yeah, we just hear our pastors or the teachers on the radio, and it's just, oh, okay, that must be true then. And then we pass the story on, and for the past 1,500 years, we've been talking about Bartholomew, and that may not be the case.
And you know what? The key is this is where we give ourselves grace, because in the past, as an apologist, I've said this, they all died but John.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I think I better do my homework here. So, by the way, there's even some scholars who've been emailing me recently arguing that John died as a martyr. Not sure I'm convinced, but there's this whole history of that is like people like Ben Witherington and Richard Bauckham.
Yeah, big
New
names.
Testament conservative scholars buying this. So it's a reminder to give grace because we've all been there, but also to do our homework and make sure we get it right.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, when it comes to research and studies, you know, Sean did his research in the area of, you know, the apostles and the fate of the apostles. And the funny thing is, it's like when I was getting into my research on the topic of guilt and developing a moral argument, I thought, boy, I really want to become, omniscient in a particular area, right? If I could just become omniscient in a particular area. But you know what happens? We're all borrowing scholarship. We're all at the mercy of certain authors we've read, mentors we've had. And sometimes I feel like, I've exposed myself to these different views, and I'm going, well, I like this view, and here's the reasons why. But at the end of the day, I couldn't even exhaust my own field. And I know you probably feel like, man, I got more questions about the apostles now, even though I got a PhD on it.
Well, this is where it's hard, because sometimes professors nuance things to death and you just think you can't know anything. Right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we need to, especially today, when I speak to atheists, I was speaking at Berkeley recently, they're sitting there Googling everything that I said. And I lose credibility on the spot if I'm not accurate with my facts.
Wow.
So how do we make the most careful, strong argument for Christ and the Scriptures that also reflects where the evidence really points? That's the key.
Yeah, that's well said.
Interesting stuff. We're going to open up the phone lines now. 888-564-6173 is the number to call. 888-564-6173. We're here in the studio today live with Bobby Conway, the 1 Minute Apologist YouTube guy, and also Sean McDowell, who, you're an author, you're an apologist, you're a professor. Is there anything you aren't?
I'm now a homeschool dad, and that's with all respect to homeschool dad. I'm not taking that lightly, but that's been 2 hours a day with this quarantine thing.
A lot of work.
My big thing is I teach at Biola. I actually teach high school part-time. And then I get to speak and write. And now I'm doing YouTube channel. I don't know. I get a team together, and I'm on TikTok. And
he just did a TikTok video here in the studio. That was kind of cool to watch that as he did it.
I'm trying to talk you into doing it. So when this is done, I want to see how many hits it gets, because you only get 1 minute to do a video. So none of these 1 minute apologist videos that are really 3 minutes by you, Bobby, time will run out, and we'll see how much skills you really have.
I think Bobby learned Common Core math. You might want to,
Well, you know what's funny? Our last batch of videos, they haven't come out yet. We went to doing them in a literal minute where there's a countdown from 60 seconds to
awesome.
Boom. And we're trying to be more faithful to the 1 minute element. But,
But what Bobby's not telling you is that he stretches that 1 minute clock so that if you look at it carefully, you're like, wait a minute.
That's right.
That sure is a long 5 seconds. But.
Well, one question that, as we're waiting for the lines to populate, Sean, I know that you took the work that your dad did, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and got your hands all over it.
Yeah.
And it's a phenomenal read, and you've really updated it. What was that like, and how important is that of a book for maybe Christians to consider taking the time to read and grapple with?
So the work on that was as much or maybe more than a dissertation. It was way more than I imagined. We had 36 scholars who studied with me at Biola in our apologetics program, 36 grad students. We had 12 leading scholars like Mike Lacona, Craig Blomberg, and others helping us do research and editing as well. So it was a massive text. And I felt some responsibility because that book has shaped a generation of apologists, and people kind of look at it almost like the apologetics Bible. So I thought, I got to get this thing right. So we did a few things. Number one, some material was just outdated. It's not the issues people are asking anymore, so we took that out. We updated a lot of the material, like the manuscript numbers, archaeological finds, but there's also some new issues that are relevant today that we tackled. Issues like, does Jesus even exist? That wasn't really an issue 30 plus years ago when he wrote it. I added a chapter on the apostles. So there's also a full chapter responding to kind of the mythicism argument that Christianity's borrowed from these pagan myths. That wasn't an issue, but it's become popular in the internet. So we updated it, expanded it, and it did, in its category, got one of the books of the year, which for me was just, honestly, just a way of honoring my dad.
Yeah, for sure.
That's why it mattered to me most, but I don't think, actually I know because I'm in apologetics, there's not a single volume out there that does the deity of Christ, reliability of scriptures, and the case for the resurrection together, I think argued as carefully and yet understandable to non-scholars in the way that evidence does.
That's what I felt going through it. I just really loved how current, how refreshed it was. And there was a modesty to it, I felt like, when it came to certain chapters whereby hey, this is about as far as we can go here. And, I think one of the dangers maybe of apologists in the past would be maybe we're getting a little bit overly black and white. Maybe we're coming off a little bit too confident here. And I think it's okay. I mean, Sean, you have been very open about your battle with doubts. I've had a battle with doubts, and the Lord has helped us through it. But I think some of what contributes to that is when you're presented something that could be potentially so black and white, and you feel like this is the box you have to live in, and then all of a sudden your thinking leads you to wonder outside of the box. And isn't it freeing to know that maybe the box is bigger than we were led to believe?
Yeah, that's really, really important. And I'll tell you one thing that's interesting is the first evidence came out in 1972, I believe. So if you think about the way people communicated on the free speech platforms, if you ever go watch, you would stand up and you would say things dogmatically. You'd say things strong, with force. If you showed any sign of weakness, you were done.
Right.
Well, that was kind of the way evidence was originally written. Like, we're going to put it forward. We're going to argue, show this is true. Well, that's not how people communicate today. So some people look back critical of that, and I say, okay, well, you just got to realize the milieu of how communication happened. Let's have some grace for that. So now that we realize things are nuanced, there's much more access to information. If you overstate things, you lose credibility. We tried to really nuance things in evidence without losing the force of the evidence. And I agree with you on doubt. I did go through a questioning period. And some of that, it's amazing. Doubt can have a lot of angles. There can be an emotional component. There can be a moral component. And I see a lot of my students who they just think, you know what? If you can't be a Christian and even possibly believe in evolution, they're idiots. Well, then they meet people who are Christians who say they believe in evolution. Then they meet at least what seems like decent evidence for evolution, and it rocks them. So we've got to just be careful how we communicate things to not undermine our case on the other side.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, we've only got about 3 minutes left before our break, and then we'll get to our phone calls at 888-564-6173. So, Sean, did you say that 30 years ago or so, did Jesus really exist? Wasn't even something that was talked about, but now it's just gone through the roof.
Yes, it has gone through the roof. I would say there was, if you go back to the 72 version and then the update in the 80s and the 90s, there was a smaller section on the existence of Jesus, but it wasn't very substantive, because a lot of people weren't questioning it. It's not really until the internet hits and this movement called mythicists have a platform to argue that Jesus never even existed. In fact, frankly, some of these ideas were dismissed in scholarship probably in about 1940s. But they get a new avenue, so to speak, online, and it seems appealing to people who aren't trained. So we felt like, gosh, we've got to include a chapter on this. In fact, part of my story was in the mid-90s, even at Biola, coming across this secular web, which began partly responding to my dad's book, chapter by chapter. And I get in there, and it was the first time there were lawyers and historians and doctors responding to these chapters. I'm thinking, gosh, I know my dad means well, but this sounds smart to me as a 19-year-old. And it rocked me. Now looking back, I'm like, I can't believe I was taken by those arguments, but I was 19.
Yeah.
Didn't know anything, really. So, yes, that's an example of how the conversation has changed. It has very little scholarly debate today, but in the popular world, it pops up all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of like the new atheists as well. They've been roundly refuted. Like, even with my research, we have Sam Harris, who has written A Moral Landscape. He does have his PhD, but he's not respected in the academic world because they can see that he has sort of this fundamentalist mission to eradicate belief. So even my supervisor was like, when he saw that I put a reference to Sam Harris, he says, I just lose that.
Really?
And I'm going, here's the academic head of the philosophy of religion department saying, it's just not going to weigh that much. And I was like, isn't that interesting? So you do get these popularizers who get vehement. You get Richard Carrier saying, Jesus never existed. You get the people like the New Atheists and the Four Horsemen, and their arguments end up getting refuted. But the popular level people who don't go do their deeper looking can be really persuaded by it.
All right, it's time for our break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes and start taking some questions from you on the telephone at 888-564-6173. Bobby Conway and Sean McDowell with us today on Pastor's Perspective.
Pastor's Perspective continues in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Pastor's Perspective continues with your question to 1-888-564-6173. And now here again is your host, Brian Perez.
All right, here we go with the second half of the Pastor's Perspective program, and the phone lines are now open, 888-564-6173. Bobby Conway, the YouTube guy from 1 Minute Apologist. How do you like that intro? The YouTube guy from 1 Minute Apologist.
How about the YouTube dude?
The YouTube dude. I like that. Just find him on 1 Minute Apologist, and you'll find hundreds of his videos there. And our guest today is Sean McDowell, the author and apologist and son of Josh McDowell. How is your dad doing?
My dad is doing really well. He, during this quarantine, he is like, son, I'm going to get more done than ever. He has a studio in his front room. He's calling. He's literally the quintessential person that when you turn things negative, he's like, I'm going to turn this positive times 1,000,000. Like it's a challenge to him. I'm not kidding. I've never met anybody like him. So he's doing well.
He doesn't seem to run out of gas either, right?
I don't think I've ever seen him. I've seen him tired, like he's human. We know that. But still at his age, and he was older than Ravi, he's got more energy than most people I know in their teens and 20s and 30s.
Wow. What's his secret?
You know what? I think it's a couple things. One, I think he's wired that way. Like some people are just biologically wired that way. Second, I really think it's two other things. Number one, he has a vision and a passion that drives him. And it's the gospel. And third, I really think it's the Holy Spirit inside of him.
Yeah. 888-564-6173 is our telephone number. And let's get to the phone calls now. We're going to go to Arizona. Here's Austin. Welcome to Pastor's Perspective, Austin.
Hi.
Hello.
Michael, how are you guys doing?
Good, thank you.
My question is, I know that back in the Bible, probably Old Testament, not so sure, but that a lot of idol worshiping had to do with homosexuality. It was part of their religion. Is that mainly why it is a sin? Is because it wasn't monogamous and it was to worship idols?
Okay.
Austin, I love this question. Thank you so much. And here's what I would say. If you want to know the heart of why homosexual behavior and really any sexually immoral behavior is wrong, we have to go back to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis 1, it says God made them male and female, tells them to populate and fill the earth. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, what you see is it says, and the man said, this is at last bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This one called woman, for she was taken out of man. And then verse 24, it says, this is why a man leaves his father and bonds with his wife, and they become one flesh. God designed sex to be between one man and one woman who become one flesh for one lifetime. That's the pattern at the beginning in Genesis. Now, even when you go to Leviticus chapter 18, where people argue that it was cult worship, if you read that passage very carefully, it says, a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It's using language reminiscent of Genesis 1 and 2. And then you go to Romans chapter 1, when you have the famous passage where Paul talks about people know God exists by creation, but they deny it. And it has a passage that outlaws homosexual behavior for both men and women. If you read that passage carefully, it has nothing to do with cult worship. If you read it closely, he's referring back to creation again in Genesis 1. If you go to Matthew 19, when Jesus is asked about divorce, do you know what he quotes? He quotes Genesis 1, and take a wild guess, Austin, what he also quotes. Genesis chapter 2. In other words, consistently through the Bible, we see Paul, we see Jesus, we see the scriptures pointing back towards that beginning creation account as the basis for how we are to live and behave sexually. So it's not just because it was allegedly along with cult practice. That might add another layer to it. But bottom line is God has designed sex to be between one man, one woman, in a committed, loving relationship for life. That's the heart of it.
One of the great debates that I enjoyed was when you, Sean, did a debate with Matthew Vines. And Matthew Vines wrote a book called God and the Gay Christian. You've also written a book with John Stonestreet addressing the homosexual question and whether it's a sin or not, and getting into some of the other cultural issues. I really would encourage our listeners, if you've never seen the debate between Matthew Vines and Sean McDowell. Matthew Vines went to Harvard. He grew up in a Christian home. He ends up leaving Harvard and comes to this conclusion that it's okay for him to wait for the right person to come along, be it a man that he can marry. And so he takes this position whereby, hey, as long as I wait until I have a man to marry in the context of marriage,
that's right.
I'm okay.
So his issue, which is probably the biggest, what's called revisionist argument today, is that when the Bible outlaws certain homosexual behavior, it was a certain kind of homosexual behavior. So maybe it was cultic practice, like
Right.
Austin asked. Maybe it was slavery. Maybe it was pederasty, say a man and a boy. But it has nothing to do with the, quote, monogamous, faithful, loving, same-sex relationships we see today. And that's a pretty thoughtful, sophisticated argument. The reason I don't buy it is what I just said. Consistently through Scripture, what we see is a pointing back towards the reason that God made male and female, and that marriage is a sexed, gendered union that is oriented, amongst other things, towards having kids. So you actually, for example, you look in Romans and you look in Leviticus, and both of the parties who are involved in the homosexual behavior are condemned. Now, if it was a master and a slave, it'd just be one. If it was pederasty, it'd just be one. But both are condemned for this, which tells us it's consensual to a degree, and that there's some kind of mutual relationship going on here. So the Bible really is concerned with behavior and what we do with our bodies. And I don't want to just pick on this issue. This is what he asked about.
Sure.
But this is true for all issues of sexuality, to go back to God's original design for how we are to live out our relationships.
Well said.
I want to ask Austin why this question, why he asked us this question today.
A lot of people, I've talked to people, and this is just a question that came up, and I don't know the exact answer for that.
Okay.
Because it made sense to me that it might be because of contextual, like it was because idol worshiping or it wasn't monogamous.
Well, that's the tough thing too, I think, when people are exposed to, a Vine's view without any framework of Scripture, it's easy to be susceptible in this way. It's like what, Sean, you were just talking about, being 19 years of age and going, man, it sounded good, but I was young and I hadn't had the time to really think.
That's right.
And I do get concerned. That's why I think the church needs to do strong discipleship. That's why I think we need, if pastors aren't passionate about apologetics, they need to raise up lay people who are, because we owe it to the flock to prepare them with answers to the questions that people have in the world that we live.
And any parent or pastor who's listening, I love that Austin felt free to call
Absolutely.
up to this show. This is hugely important. He represents tens of thousands of young Christians who have this question in the back of their mind. And they want to know, are they going to be okay with asking this? Are we going to still love them? And are we going to help them think it through scripturally?
Right. That's right.
When I had that conversation that you mentioned with Matthew Vines, there's a whole lot of pastors and people, there's a handful of vocal ones that try to talk me out of it. And I said, no, we have to take these issues seriously. I want on record the best of the revisionists, and I want to be able to push back. We have nothing to be afraid of if we do our homework.
That's right.
So I would encourage him and others to just Google my name, Matthew Vines, homosexuality, and watch so you can see both sides. And when we point back to Scripture, I think it's really clear what it teaches.
The thing that I felt really good about this debate is Matthew Vines. He does have a winsome personality. People are really drawn to him, very friendly natured. So that doesn't take away that either. I mean, he's a nice guy. But what made this debate so great is if you would have juxtaposed in a debate somebody that would have been harsh and arrogant and condescending with Matthew, then it would have made it all the more difficult for people to digest the views being presented by Sean. But what you will see is that Sean is equally charming, friendly, kind, gracious, yet he does not back down at all. And he really brings Matthew to a place of saying, this is what the text is saying. And he would not let him go. And by the time it was over, it was just, to me, it wasn't even a debate, but the thing that was so great about it is that Sean did it in that loving, gracious, humble way.
I did find that video on YouTube, and I put a link to it on the Facebook stream that's going on right now, so you guys can watch that. Not right now, because we're still on the program here for another 15 minutes. But
that's right. Stick with us.
That's right. We've got about 15 minutes left, and we'd love to hear from you. 888-564-6173. Pastor's Perspective is the name of the program. In the studio with Bobby Conway and our guest, Sean McDowell. You can find out more about Sean at seanmcdowell.org. Next, we're going to go to Westminster. Here is Gail. Thank you for calling Pastor's Perspective.
Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen and dude.
Wow, Gail, dude. You are the best. I love Gail.
As my 2-year-old neighbor girl would say, I got a problem. Lucifer got thrown out of heaven because he got jealous and wanted to be worshipped. Well, I thought heaven was supposed to be void of anything like jealousy and envy. How could that have been in
Bobby?
heaven?
Well, this is why Lucifer gets kicked out of heaven, so to speak. Now, when we think about the fall of Lucifer, we know that pride stiffened up in his heart. He would rebel against God, and that pride cost him the joy of being in God's presence forever. And so he was cast out of God's presence. It is an interesting thing, though, is how when we think about it, like when we're in heaven, we'll say, heaven's a perfect place and no imperfection can be in a perfect place. Otherwise, it would no longer be a place of perfection. But in order for free will to fully have its place, God in the angelic realm and in the human realm gave humans and angels an opportunity to freely love him. And Lucifer rebels against God, and he was cast out of God's presence, and God dealt with that swiftly.
Did you want to add anything, Sean?
Sure. I think it's interesting when we look at the biblical evidence for Lucifer being jealous and kicked out. It's in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. It's probably the case, but it's not crystal clear. There's even some scholarly debate about this that I think is fair. But it's a narrative that makes sense of how you could have an evil being when we know God doesn't create evil. Now, if I guess the follow-up question would be, is if Lucifer was kicked out in heaven, then we get to heaven someday, is there a possibility that we get kicked out?
Right.
Well, there's two ways scholars answer this. One is they'll say we cease having free will when we are in heaven, or have a different kind of free will. That's a possibility. Or the difference is, number one, we have chosen to be with God in a way that Lucifer didn't originally choose. He just creates in there. And second, we've been redeemed completely by a new creation of Christ. And our bodies and minds have been transformed. And now we see sin for how horrible and terrible it is. So its temptation is gone. So there's no temptation inside. There's no temptation without. So you could say somebody logically could by their free will sin, but they just simply never would. Any more, to use a morbid example, than I would take my son above a freeway and say, hey, I wonder if he's going to balance when I drop him off. Like, it's just so absolutely insane because of my love for him. The littlest sin, I think, we'll see with utter clarity, and the temptation will be gone when we get to heaven.
I've often thought about, Adam and Eve being the most miserable people alive, because for them, after they were cast out of the garden, so to speak. And you can look at the garden, that was set up to be this perfect place where they were to have fellowship with God, and then they're cast out, and then the cherubim are placed in front of it. And I think for Adam and Eve, they would always be looking back to how great it was.
Yeah.
So their whole human experience, however long they ended up living, would always be grasping for what once was. And through our lens as Christians, when we look back, we think, thank God I'm no longer there. But when they looked back, they thought, how can I get back there? And to your point, Sean, I think that kind of a clear focus for an Adam and Eve would let them realize once in heaven, oh, I never want to do that again. And our understanding through the lens that we have would help us to not want to do that again. And I'd also want to validate, I do think Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, that Sean's right to point that out, because when you read it, it's not completely clear if this is the angelic realm or just speaking about an earthly king like Cyrus or whatever. And so when I read that, I think, man, we have built a lot of theology around angels and demons and Lucifer on some real ambiguous passages. And I think that that's a fair note. I think that there's more to be heard about the serpent in the book of Revelation. I think that we can capture a lot of stuff. I have really appreciated Michael Heiser's thoughts.
Yeah.
It's controversial to a degree, but his stuff on angels, the unseen realm, this just recently came out with a new book on demons. It's a 500-page tome.
Yeah.
I think that he writes some stuff as a scholar, and he's just forcing us to kind of say, hey, are we just accepting this because this is the way it's always been taught? Look at these verses. Look at what's going on.
And you know what? That's why I would encourage Gail, just go back and look at Ezekiel 28, read Isaiah 14. And that's why I'm thankful for my Old Testament training. I teach at Bible, but I went there and I had, great scholars like David Talley teaching me Old Testament. And that's why I read it differently. So go back to that text itself and really read it and maybe pick up a commentary to get a bigger sense of what's going on in those two passages.
Yeah, what do you think David would say about Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14?
You know,
do you remember?
If David said it, that settles it. I believe
it. Okay, well, good.
So let's get David on the program.
That's right. David, call us up, bro.
Yes. Gail, thanks for your phone call today on Pastor's Perspective, 888-564-6173. I've been telling you guys the past few days about this new phone system that we have here, and I think I've got the hang of it. Today, I'm going to try something else new. When the program is over, if we have not gotten to your phone call, we're going to push a magic button, and you can leave your question as a recording, and we'll try to answer it at a later date. We kind of used to do that a few months ago, and we stopped doing it when we started doing live programs on Monday. But we're going to test it today with this new system. Kind of cool. 888-564-6173. Let's go to Adam in Anaheim with our next question about human sacrifice. Hi there, Adam. Welcome to the program.
Hey, guys. How you doing?
Doing all right.
Good, bro.
How can we help you?
So I had a question about Judges 11. I was reading and it said that Jephthah made a he made like a deal with God. He made a vow to God that he would sacrifice his daughter if he won the battle. And then at the end of Judges 11, he sacrificed her. But I've always heard messages in the past where it talked about how Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, but God wouldn't accept that, and that's part of the reason why he stopped him. He just wanted to see his heart, because that was kind of included in like other religions with like idol worship, where they would accept human sacrifice. So I just wanted to hear your guys' take on that, because I was kind of confused.
Okay, Bobby?
Well, regarding Genesis 22, it is true that Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and he would have been familiar with a culture that was valuing sacrifice, human sacrifice, that was a way to show one's faith toward their belief in their gods. And I would say, like with Moab and the god of Chemosh, and you would see these type of things taking place. The truth is Abraham would have thought through the lens that he experienced that the greatest way to demonstrate his faith is through human sacrifice, because that's what he would have seen other cultures teaching. But when he was about to sacrifice Isaac, and it does tell us in the book of Hebrews that he reasoned that God could raise him from the dead. When he was about to sacrifice, God intervenes and says, stop. And it was really to flip the whole idea on its head, as if to say, I'm not like the other gods. You come from a culture that values human sacrifice, child sacrifice, and that's not the way that I roll. And therefore, he was giving him an example of the fact that he does not permit human sacrifice. In fact, in the law, God, there's consequences for human sacrifice. He judges human sacrifice. So I love that, because a lot of times people can think like Soren Kierkegaard struggled, and we talked about this idea of the teleological suspension of the ethical, where God suspends this ethical reality that you would think, like human sacrifice. He suspends it for a purpose. And Soren Kierkegaard thought, that's what God's doing. He's suspending the ethical to pull off a particular purpose. And, he was an existentialist, and he just kind of takes this leap of faith, trusting God in spite of. But I think that we don't have to go so far. I think we can say that God did stop, God did intervene. God meets Abraham where he's at, because he's an accommodating God, in order to bring Abraham to where he's at to understand the worldview of Yahweh. I'll let Sean take the Judges passage as it relates to Jephthah.
Very generous of you, man.
I get it on this program all the time, so I want to share it with you.
Way to sacrifice the glory for me. I think your answer was great. I actually think when we read the story of Abraham and Isaac, the story is telling us that God doesn't want sacrifice, because it was universal. And they're including a story and saying, no, don't sacrifice. God will provide, while testing his faithfulness at that time. When you go to the story of Jephthah, remember, what is the theme of the book of Judges? And everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. You have these stories of these fallen, broken, immoral heroes that we love because the stories are fascinating, that God uses nonetheless. So I think we have to make a distinction between what the Bible records here and between what the Bible endorses.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we have the story of recording things about Samson, but clearly it's not endorsing cutting your hair. In your case, Bobby, I'm just kidding. I'm messing with you. Clearly, don't cut your hair. I love it. It's clearly not endorsing the immoral things that he did in his life. Same with the other fallen heroes. The whole theme is, I think you hear about this tent peg going through a head in the story of Deborah. You hear about Ehud and the guts falling out, not because the Bible's trying to overdo it like a movie that just adds gore to get ratings, but it wants us to realize if you go down this road of sin, it's going to be costly and it's going to lead to death and people are going to suffer.
Yeah.
So the Bible's not endorsing what Jephthah did, but it's reporting somebody who's a part of this larger narrative who frankly made a very, very foolish vow to the Lord.
Yeah, and that's a great way of putting it. Now, some have sought to get around it by saying, you know what, she ended up having to sacrifice was her virginity, and
that's right.
She'd go away and grieve for a little while. So that's one option that people would say. Others would say, no, he literally would have ended up sacrificing his child. The interesting thing is where the foolish thing, the Bible says in Proverbs 20:25, it is a trap for a person to dedicate something rashly, only later to consider their vows. And that was so rash. But I try to stand in Jephthah's shoes, Sean, Brian, I think, well, what did he expect to come out of his house? I mean, was it his wife? Like, I wish it was my wife. Or, no, I'm just kidding. But that's the foolishness of it. Like, if he goes and the victory is won, someone's going to die that's going to come out of his house. Mm-hmm. So you can just see how squirrely people are at. But Sean, great distinction. Not everything that the Bible records does it approve.
And by the way, if I could jump in, listen to Jeremiah 32:35. It says, they have built high places of Baal in Ben-Hinnom Valley to sacrifice their sons and daughters in the fire to Molech, something I had not commanded them. I had never entertained the thought that they would do this detestable act causing Judah to sin.
That's so good.
Adam, thank you for your phone call today on Pastor's Perspective. Next, we're going to go to, where's the one I was going to go to? Carlos in West Covina. Hello. What's your question?
Hello, pastors. Yes, I'd like to express that the Lord can do anything that He wants. Is that correct?
Can the Lord do anything that He wants?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So let me take a step back and give some qualification for this. The Bible says that God is almighty, so God has unlimited power. But we have to ask the question, what does it mean for God to be all-powerful? Can God make 2 + 2 = 5? Can God make a square circle? And the answer is no, because such things are illogical and they can't exist. So traditionally, theologians have said, God, being all-powerful, can do anything that power can do. But then the second qualifier relates to what you're talking about, is that we also know in the Bible it says in James and then in Hebrews, God can't lie. God can't sin. I said this to one of my students one time, like, wait a minute, I can sin and God can't? I'm more powerful than God. I said, well, I think you're missing the point.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, God is perfect and He's holy. He can't sin. That's a strength. So technically, God can do anything He wants. But we have to remember the character of God is He doesn't just do good, He is good. He doesn't just act lovingly, He is love. He doesn't just do justice, He is just.
All right. Carlos, thank you for your phone call today on Pastor's Perspective, and hope that answers your question. But we have run out of time on today's program. Man, that was a quick hour. Sean McDowell, thank you so much for joining us today on Pastor's Perspective. Folks, you can find out more about Sean at his website. It's seanmcdowell.org, and Sean is spelled S-E-A-N. Make sure you spell it right, not S-H whatever. It's S-E-A-N, McDowell, mcdowell.org. And Bobby Conway, find him on YouTube. He's the YouTube dude. 1 Minute Apologist is how you can find out more about him. You know, a few weeks ago, we established that Bobby owns YouTube. Now he's the YouTube dude.
Yeah,
is that a step up or a step down? We don't know. And if you're on hold, stay on hold, and we can transfer your call and record it for future use. God bless.
Thanks for listening to Pastor's Perspective. We trust you've been blessed and had your question answered. Join us Monday through Friday and follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Pastor's Perspective. The preceding was sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, California.